Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to the Nautel webinar on FM translators for AM stations. Also subtitled as We've Got the License Now, What Do We Do? And other translator tricks and suggestions. I'm Chuck Kelly with Nautel, thanking you for being a part of this, and I'm joined by two wonderful co-hosts. Jeff Welton is Regional Sales Manager for the Central U.S. For Nautel and has done an awful lot of these translators. Jeff, welcome.
Thank you very much, Chuck. Good to be here.
And John Garziglia in Washington, D.C. is a partner in Womble Carlyle, Sandridge & Rice, a communications attorney and a broadcaster, incidentally, who has an awful lot of knowledge on translators. Welcome, John. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, and I've also helped a lot of people with translators, so I'm happy to be here.
Fantastic. So the things we're going to tackle today, and I should preface this by just a second before I get into the whole overview, I want to preface this with a little bit of history. We are here talking about this today for the U.S. Translators, AM broadcast translators on FM, because of the AM revitalization plan that Chairman Ajit Pai put together several years ago and is now carrying forward as the chairman of the FCC. And all the thanks and kudos to the FCC. Not often said that in my life, but often all the kudos to the FCC for taking on this important thing. We're going to talk today about the legal aspects of AM broadcast translators, the source, the audio source, the originating program, how you make moves and changes, interference issues. We're also going to focus a little bit on the technical side of things, features of equipment, building on a budget, and the must-have items. So without further ado, let's get started. I will mention that we'll have an opportunity for you all to ask your questions. You'll notice on the GoToWebinar app that there is a place to ask questions. Ask them at any time during the program, and we'll answer them near the end. Do bear in mind that if you're counting SBE recertification credits, you get a half a credit for just being here today. So that's a sweet deal. So we've got the construction permit. Now what, Jeff?
Okay, first off, I'm going to say I'm not seeing the slides advancing, Chuck, so I'm not sure if you're in pause mode or not, but
fix that. How's that?
There we go.
Let me back up and show you pretty pictures too. How about that?
Oh, I don't know if anybody needed to see that.
We needed that. That's good. All right.
That's real important. Yeah, absolutely. And then this is the information about the questions. Thanks for pointing that out, Jeff. And now we've got a construction permit. What do we do?
Okay, so obviously we've got to deal with what equipment we need for a translator application, especially as a booster or an in-contour translator, which we'll discuss later. The requirements are a little different than a traditional off-air translator. So we're going to discuss how we feed the program to it, what our options are. We're going to talk about some of the other things because there are some little gotchas in there. And John had brought up a good one earlier where we're looking at a blanked out picture of a construction permit that I grabbed from one of my customer files. And John had mentioned earlier, and this was kind of interesting, that the construction permit as issued doesn't specify, for example, an antenna, but the application does. And when you get the CP, that's the antenna you have to use. So we'll stress that a little further along too. So those are the sort of things we're going to get into from the technical aspect. And I think John's going to deal a lot with the legalities of it, what we can do for program feed, when we have to be on or off, and various things like that.
There's an awful lot of content to this, a lot more than I thought when we first talked about doing this webinar, an awful lot of very interesting information. John, I'm interested in the history of this. How did we get to this point? I mean, we said here we've got the construction permit, but what did people do to get to this point today in just real quick form? What were the various avenues to get one of these construction permits?
Well, there's any number of ways that somebody came to the point where they have a construction permit here to build out a translator for an AM station. It might have been one of the original ones granted in the 2003 window and perhaps granted some time ago, but now the AM station has finally managed to find a way to modify it to serve the AM station, or it could have been an existing translator there from the 2003 window. Many AM stations moved translators using the tune waivers, or perhaps multiple hops. There were stories of stations using 15, 16, 17 hops at one time to move translators, something the FCC staff has pretty much shut down now. More recently, if you've got a translator construction permit in hand right now, it probably is because you participated in the 250-mile move window that took place last year that resulted in a whole bunch, hundreds of construction permits being granted to AM stations to build out an FM translator. And then looking forward, if you're looking to be getting a construction permit here in the next several months, it's probably because your AM station participated as a Class C or D in the most recent filing window for AM translators. We now have 1,000 plus applications pending at the FCC. Most are singletons, not mutually exclusive. And once we go through the settlement window we've got going right now for the mutually exclusive applications, we hope to see grants of these construction permits like the one you've got on the screen coming out, perhaps early 2018. We'll see those construction permits start flowing out of the FCC. So that's how we got where we are. And I suspect, Jeff and I were talking a little bit beforehand about who's in the audience, and I suspect we may have some AM broadcasters who've done their own engineering all their lives, done only AM work. And to the extent that this now involves FM and FM translators, we'll try to emphasize some of the differences and some of the things to watch out for here as we go through this FM translator process. If you are almost exclusively an AM broadcaster or an AM engineer in that regard.
That's great. Now, there is one more filing window, I understand, that is potentially opening up early next year.
That's right. The FCC has one more filing window for AM stations, and this will involve any AM station that's not already taken advantage of filing in either the 250-mile window or in the first AM window that was for Class Cs and Ds, which just occurred. And I like to emphasize to broadcasters, AM broadcasters who might already have a translator but didn't file either in the 250-mile window or in the most recent new application filing window that just took place, that even if you have a translator, you can file in this upcoming window for a translator, and you might find a use for both translators with the FCC expanding the areas now where FM translators can be located for an AM station. It used to be it had to be within the 2 millivolt per meter contour and a 25-mile radius, the lesser of the two. Now the FCC's expanded it so it can be anywhere within a 25-mile radius of the AM transmitter site, just so the 60 dBu of the translator doesn't extend beyond the 25-mile radius. So that means for many AM stations, you could find two disparate areas to put in a translator. The FCC does require that they not overlap more than 50%, but you could find a place for a new translator even if you have one. So that window sometime first quarter, maybe first half of 2018 is what we're looking at.
And it's really not too early to start thinking about this, start doing the technical planning, contacting a consulting engineer, an attorney, whatever, and making the plans on doing that.
No, not at all. I mean, what we will see changing in the next month or so is there will be some shuffling, reshuffling of the facilities applied for right now under this latest filing window as this mutually exclusive as the mutually exclusive applications go into settlement. We're going to see a number of technical changes taking place, but other than that, an AM broadcaster can pretty much look at the frequency spectrum in their area, and particularly in smaller markets and more rural areas, there's likely to still be a number of FM translator frequencies, and an AM broadcaster should seriously consider filing in this window.
This is pretty much of a sea change for American AM broadcasters. And I should mention that this is a phenomenon specifically limited to the United States at this point in time, but it's a big potential change for an American AM broadcaster.
Well, AM broadcasters ever since Docket 8090, which is now, 3 decades ago, had been asking for the ability to acquire FM stations. And there was some criticism in these windows that this wasn't revitalizing or saving AM as a technical matter, and that's correct. It's getting an FM translator for an AM station does nothing to revitalize or save the technical facility that we know as AM, but it certainly does save the radio service that's being delivered to all these communities across the United States by AM stations, and hopefully makes those AM stations more robust, stronger, and able to survive in the future.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's move on here. Let's talk about equipment. Jeff, walk us through this slide.
Okay, well, transmitter-wise, basically any transmitter that can be used for a Part 73 for a full licensed station can be used for a translator. There are a list of features that we will touch on as we go along that may make one more applicable than another, but the big caveat is that unlike LPFM, translators can use pretty much any broadcast transmitter. You're going to want an audio processor because, of course, AM with NRSC is processed much differently than FM with preemphasis. So, you know, again, that could be an internal to the transmitter processor, which, of course, we'll discuss the way we do it. And you might also look at an external option for various reasons. Antenna, that's pretty much a given, but once again, the caveat that your construction permit application specified an antenna. It specified it right down to the model number, not just the number of bays. And whatever is on that application needs to be what you put up, at least initially. You may change it later, and John will get into that in a bit, but definitely whatever you applied for, that's what you're building. You don't spec transmitter. I think they just say any type approved transmitter, and of course audio processing, it's a Ford Chevy thing. Everybody's got their preference. There are other things you are going to want to consider because FM translators for AM are, as John said, within the contour. They're an in-contour translator. They are typically fed directly instead of off the air. And so you may be looking at audio distribution, whether distribution amps, whether you're using IP codecs, whether you're using IP to control the transmitter. And finally, the other big thing is that a translator must be able to be taken down if the main signal goes off air due to failure at any time. The only exception where a translator would be on if a main is off would be a Class D daytime AM. So we'll discuss that in a little more detail as well.
Okay, very good.
Jeff, I
John?
think this morphs right into your next slide, which is I do think we have to emphasize this antenna issue. If you've built out full power FM facilities, the usual way it works is you get your construction permit and then you determine what antenna to use, and then when the license application is filed, that's when the antenna that is used, the transmit antenna that is used, is specified on the license application. For an FM translator, it is the antenna that was specified in the application that resulted in the construction permit. And many times these antennas are specified because there is a second adjacent channel waiver sought or other antenna configuration for RF purposes that is required to be used in the grant of that application. So I've had far too many broadcasters who are building out their new FM translator facility, and then they tell me when they're ready to file the application and turn the facility on the air that, by the way, we used an ERI rather than a Shively or something, or we used a 2-bay rather than a 4-bay. And I say, whoops, we've got to go back and get a modification application filed for your construction permit before you can go on the air. So the word of wisdom now is to take a look, see what antenna was specified in the application, and if you need to make a change, assuming that you can still meet the specs that the application was granted under, it's not a big deal to file a modification application with the FCC to change that transmit antenna, but it'll take several weeks or perhaps a little longer, and it's several weeks that you don't want to spend that when you've got the thing all ready to go on the air and ready to fire it up.
That's great information. Okay, Jeff, anything else you want to mention on antenna?
Well, the one other thing, and it's a maybe situation, but a lot of the FM translators for AMs are co-located with the AM. Obviously, it's a convenience of space. You already own the site. You've got the tower. Everything's in place. And if you're putting it on an AM tower, depending on the configuration, you may require isolation. So you can't just bolt an FM antenna rather on a hot AM stick. Now, I mean, I'm sure we've got a lot of engineers listening, and it's pretty obvious to them, but sometimes it's easy to overlook the simple things too. So I just wanted to reinforce that. We'll touch on it again in a bit.
Yep.
On this slide, once again, the antenna configuration will determine the transmitter size. I still get a lot of calls, and of course, what will happen, the engineers know all this, and they go through and do all the math and get it all figured out. And then we'll get a call from the station owner who doesn't necessarily know that and go, I need a 250 watt transmitter. Well, and the owner will be talking the ERP, the radiated power, versus the transmitter power, which is a function of radiated power, antenna gain, and line loss. I put the little formula on the slide. So definitely when you're talking to a transmitter sales guy, we speak TPO. We don't really care what the ERP is, but we need to know how many watts you need out of our box. So that's the sort of thing. I've actually had somebody make that mistake to the point where it got almost a transmitter shipping time before somebody said, hey, wait a second, these two numbers don't seem to line up right.
Yeah.
And,
Jeff, the other place this comes up is in filing the license application. I've learned to watch out for license applications where I'm given the TPO by maybe the contract engineer, or maybe it's the more than likely it's the owner of the station who puts down the TPO as 250 watts. And if it's a 250 watt ERP translator, immediately I ask, well, wait a minute, this just doesn't seem right. Are you really able to do this with the line loss and the antenna gain and et cetera, the formula I have up on the screen? And most of the time, in fact, I'd say 99% of the time, I was surprised once when it was exactly the ERP, the TPO. But most of the time, it turns out, well, no, it wasn't the ERP at all that was supposed to be put down on the license application. It was a TPO. So just to mention that.
Right, it is something to be aware of. The other thing is if you're in a northern climate, you may or may not want to consider radomes and de-icers, which of course add cost, and they also add weight and wind load to the tower. And Chuck's familiar with the community station that I co-engineer up here, and we're running without either because, well, our tower is not going to support the extra weight. And of course, you've got a potential downside there because if you get an ice storm, bad things can happen to a system. You spend a lot of time at very reduced power some days. Yep. But again, something that may require structural study of the tower. It may require an actual structural engineering firm to come in and make sure that it'll handle it. So just those sort of little details are the things we need to look at.
Good points. Okay, let's move on. So we're talking about isolation now. If we're talking about putting an FM antenna on an AM tower, we're going to need to have some way of getting the power coupled to the tower.
Right. And remembering that the antenna mounts on the tower, the coax runs up it. However, for the AM, the tower is the antenna. So there are some applications. Basically, if you've got a series-fed tower, insulated base, you're going to need some kind of isocoupler unless, and you'd mentioned this one earlier, Chuck, and it's a good point, if your tower is more than a quarter wavelength, more than 90 degrees in electrical height, you could insulate the feed line up to the 90-degree point and bond it to the tower at that point, effectively create a dipole and put the AM above it, or the FM antenna above it. One other thing that's important, and I've run across this on a few construction permits I reviewed, is when you're mounting on an AM tower, one of the things the FCC frequently insists is a condition of the CP is that you need to go through and do the impedance measurements and make absolutely sure that you didn't affect the AM impedance and thus affect your power readings. So that's useful information and something that's important to think about as well.
I think John brought up that actually taking measurements may be stipulated as a part of your license, and you've got to have that done the first day you go on the air. Is that right, John?
Well, that's right, and that's one thing I say when the construction permit is issued, and I say it's the owners rather than the engineers, because engineers look at the construction permit, but the owners often don't, and maybe don't even pass along a copy of the construction permit to the engineer who's in charge of building out this facility, and that is take a look at what conditions are placed on the construction permit. And typically, if an FM translator antenna is to be on an AM tower, or even in proximity to an AM tower, there will be an AM measurement condition placed on that construction permit, and the construction permit will say that if there's more than a 2% change, I believe, in the impedance measurements or other criteria, that there must be an FCC Form 302 AM filed. That's the AM license application filed at the same time as the FCC Form 350 translator license application is filed. So too many times I've had translators built and somebody just forgets about that. They don't take the necessary equipment along out to the site that's building out the translator, and they forget about it, and we go and are ready to file the 350 license application for the translator, and we don't have the measurement data, or worse yet, we don't have the before and after measurement data that was needed for the AM towers and for the Form 302 AM. Another condition that's often placed on FM translator grants are spurious emission measurements that are required. And again, you've got to have specialized equipment to do these spurious emission measurements. And so you should be sure that whoever's going to go out there and build it is aware of this condition and is ready to do the measurements when the thing is put on the air, because the Form 350 will require that you file these measurements along with the license application.
Good points, John. Let me ask a question. So another method of coupling the FM signal to the AM tower is if you happen to have a skirt-fed, or what they call a folded unipole antenna. In those situations, would you still likely have to make different impedance measurements and things like that, or is it only in the case of an isocoupler or whatever?
A lot of it will specify on the license or on the CP, the construction permit, to be certain. Yep. But as a rule, because the base of a skirt fed is at ground, I think it may depend where your AM or your FM antenna goes relative to the ground point. If you're staying fairly low below the coupling point for the AM skirts, I don't see it being an issue at all. There should be no change to the impedance at that point. Above that, to be honest, I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
And the other question I've got tied to this for John, and I just thought of it, we hadn't discussed it earlier, so if he doesn't have an answer, we may all be sitting here looking blank. John, what about a AM that's certified for method of moments proofing?
Meaning what kind of measurements have to be taken?
Yeah, because of course they don't do the radials or run the radials on a regular annual basis. They do the MOM or proof and call it a good day. So how would putting an FM on that affect it?
I mean, it's whatever the condition on the construction permit initially says, and this is where I would say to the owner of the AM station or whoever's building this thing out, let's call the consulting engineer and find out what needs to be done, because the commission did just make some dramatic changes to how the moments of method procedure works, and I wouldn't want to.
See if I can get it back.
Hello?
I'm here. I think Chuck's having some technical difficulty in the background.
Okay. I'm sorry. I heard somebody whispering in my ear something. So well, Jeff, and answer your question, I'd flip it over to the consulting engineer.
Okay, very good. Chuck, are you back with us?
I am back. Thanks. So I don't know what in the world happened. Murphy visited my house. All right. So on to the next slide. So VS series transmitters have presets. How are those beneficial to an AM translator operation, Jeff?
Well, and this comes back to, we mentioned it briefly earlier, but the Class D AM daytimers running translators are as far as I know, the only situation where a translator can originate program. And as a result of that, they may choose to feed a different program source to it in the overnight hours when, of course, the AM transmitter's off and the studio may or may not be empty. So we've got the ability to run configurable presets. Each preset can be configured for power, which of course wouldn't change, frequency, which wouldn't change, but audio source, which absolutely would potentially change. So you might run preset 1 during the day and feed your studio audio. You may run preset 2 at night with a satellite feed or a different audio source or a different studio location, whatever you wish to do. And the cool thing is that the transmitter has a scheduler, basically an automation system built into it, so that we can set it to do time of day switching and tie it directly to the on-hour times of the AM license to switch back and forth. The other thing, and this is something we discussed earlier, is that a lot of times, depending on the revenue of the translator versus potentially a co-owned FM station, the translator may be pulled out of translator service and put up as an aux for the FM. And I mean, there'd be additional licensing required, right, John? You'd need to license your tower as an aux site.
Well, this is something we did discuss, and it's something I had never thought about, but it makes a lot of sense. And that is that one transmitter, or if you were lucky enough to have two of your transmitters at one transmitter site, one as a main transmitter for the translator, and then as a backup translator and transmitter, you could also license that same site if you had a broadband transmit antenna, which we go back now to the selection of the transmit antenna, which takes on additional importance. But if there was a broadband enough antenna up there and a broadcaster had a full service FM station that he or she wanted to use this transmitter as an auxiliary site for when the main transmitter had to go down or went down, it's very possible that you could have two presets inside your transmitter here, and one would be for the translator, and the other would be for the frequency for which the main station operates on. And Jeff, I guess that's where you take over and explain how that switching would work with your preset work, your preset things here on the translator.
Right, and again, that's something we can do with we could do it with external silent sense on a non-Nautel transmitter to cause ours to turn on if we lost audio from the primary transmitter. There's infinite ways it can be done, so you definitely want to talk to your manufacturer reps for the various options. And of course, we can tailor something from extremely basic to this thing will never be off the air ever, and you're going to pay a little more for that.
Mm-hmm. I see two things then. You need the auxiliary antenna authorization, so that's something from the FCC for the other station, and then you'd need a broadband antenna, I think, to do this setup. Is that correct?
Right, and then if you were using it with a backup translator transmitter as the aux, you'd also potentially be looking at either a combiner or switching systems of some sort to get the signals up there. So there is a little bit of technical aspect to it, but it's certainly something we can handle. And let's say switching frequencies on a transmitter is as simple as pulling up a different preset. One of the other things that we do have with the presets and with the user interface on the VS, and I don't think we're the only one, I think there are others that have this as well, but we can configure it to either auto switch to like a backup input on an audio failure. We could have it configured so that in the evening when it's running off of a different source for a Class D daytimer again, where it switches to an alternate source. During the daytime when the AM transmitter is on air, we could have it configured to shut the transmitter off. And I'm going to go out on a limb here. I forget whether it was version 4 or whether it's the next version up. But the goal is to have it configured so that it can be brought back when the audio returns. So like if your main transmitter shuts down and somebody's able to reset it, then the translator comes back up when the main transmitter comes up.
Yet another reason to make sure your software is up to date.
Oh, absolutely. Look, I can't tell you how often I beat that drum.
Yep.
The thing, just to put the plug in there again, the thing I remind everybody is what we used to do with little plastic baggies full of various components, a piece of paper with instructions, and cut this track and solder this jumper. We now do it with a software update.
A lot easier.
It's not just adding features. A lot of times software updates encompass reliability issues, amplifier biasing, things like that.
Sure. Tell us about FSK ID.
Okay, FSK ID on the VS is built in. It's a standard feature for everyone. It's only available on the front panel, not through the user interface, so it can be a little tricky to find. But it is in there. It is covered in the operation instruction manual for the transmitter. And basically, it gives you a Morse code ID. We'll talk about the ID requirements a little bit down the road. But it gives you the ability to ID without requiring an actual oral or audio ID every 2 or 3 times a day.
Great. Okay. Let's move on. Legal notes on audio. So tell us about the legalities of all this with regard to, how we feed audio to these transmitters, John.
Well, it's useful to note that, and for those in the audience who have primarily worked on perhaps NCE translators or translators that were out of contour, extending the signal of the main station, there is a distinction in the FCC's rules for several different purposes between in-contour translators and out-of-contour translators, whereby an in-contour translator is either completely contained within the 2 millivolt per meter or 25-mile radius of an AM station, or it's contained within the primary contour, the 60 dBu, 54, or 57, as applicable for an FM HD2 or HD3 station. So here we're pretty much only talking about in-contour translators. So we're not going to be touching on the portions of the rules that speak to out-of-contour translators today. And for in-contour translators, the FM translator, first of all, any FM translator has to rebroadcast a primary station, and it cannot originate programming except, and with the one exception, for an FM translator carrying a Class D daytime only AM station during the nighttime hours. And to add to that, that AM station must have been on the air in the last 24 hours for that nighttime carriage to take place. So no, you can't turn off the AM station because the FM translator sounds so good. I've been asked that question. And no, a Class B station can't all of a sudden lose its nighttime authority because one of the towers went bad and it's on an STA, and have authorization, at least out of the box, without any further authority from the FCC to originate programming during the nighttime hours. It's only for Class D, daytime only stations that the origination of programming is allowed during the nighttime hours. Now, the in-contour, out-of-contour aspect of the translator also affects the audio feed. For out-of-contour translators, leaving aside those translators in the reserve band, the non-commercial band, for a commercial band translator between channels 222 through 300, you can feed that translator however you wish by any terrestrial means you can think of. STL, straight wire, over-the-air, internet, anything but satellite can feed that translator. So you had mentioned, Jeff, I guess a little bit before, about all the different ways that these translators, these transmitters can be fed. So that really does speak to how the translator can be fed. Now, we did have a discussion before we started this webinar about feeding FM translators directly from an AM receiver. And Jeff mentioned he knew of several stations that were doing that, and it didn't sound bad. There are high quality receivers still being made that sound as good as they did back in the 1960s that can run an AM station. But I guess as an attorney, I would be a little bit wary of doing that, only because I'm aware it's so easy to hijack an AM signal that's going into an FM translator. I mean, just any FM or any AM transmitter that's placed close to that FM translator could hijack the signal and put something else over the air. So I'd be a little bit leery about feeding an FM translator with an AM receiver, but that's just my cautionary note there. So does that have I gone through this whole list here, Jeff? I tend to go on, and what should I what else? What
else? Great information.
Yeah, the only thing we hadn't covered was what if the main transmitter or if you're rebroadcasting in HD fails, and I think we did touch it briefly before. Basically, the only answer is you're shutting the translator off.
Well, that's right. Section 74.1234(a)(2) of the Commission's rules says you got to have an automatic circuit on the FM transmitter to place it on a non-radiating mode if there is no input signal. I mean, that's pretty clear to me, and right. No ifs, ands, or buts about that. So, yeah, no audio, no signal should be going out over the air from the transmitter, the translator transmitter.
And going back to the VS, one of the cool things, or one of the features it has, is an audio loss monitor. So if the incoming audio feed goes away, you've got a couple of options, one of which would be change preset to, for example, another audio source. One of the other options is shut it off.
Right, but if the audio goes away, that's only for an AM station. That's only at night. Remember, for the AM daytime only. You can't switch to another audio source If you're talking about feeding a transmitter two different ways, one, for instance, let's say we're running an HD2 signal on a transmitter, yes, you could have an HD2 receiver there, and you could also have a backup internet line, and I guess your transmitter would switch back and forth between those two, wouldn't it?
Right, but thirdly, you could have it configured so that if both of those were dead, it shut the transmitter off.
Okay, good.
So loss of main, loss of translator.
Mm-hmm. The transmitter is compatible with all kinds of cool things. It's just you got to program it. You got to set it up to do exactly what the commission says. And I'm pretty sure there's a lot of people have no clue as to these fine points.
There's a lot of details in there. You can spend a lot of time messing around with user interface before you figure out all the little tips and tricks to it, for sure.
You bet. Let's talk about the internal USB player that's built into the VS series.
It's pretty basic. You put your audio files as MP3 or WAV onto the USB stick. You build playlists with those audio files. And one of the cool things one of my customers is doing, they do a lot of off-air monitoring, so they wanted the oral ident for the translator, but they didn't want to have an ID chain that was like 85 stations long or pick some number that's insane. Mm-hmm. So they put the ident for the translator as a 30-second spot onto a USB stick. They use the scheduler to access that one file playlist at 3 times a day during the translator ident portions of the day. They play the playlist and then they switch back to the direct feed that is the same audio for their AM. So they're using the USB audio only to provide the ID for the translator.
Very
there's
flexible.
a lot of other things you could do. Like I say, you could set it up for an emergency overnight if your STL goes down overnight for your Class D daytimer when you're originating programming, then the USB will give you backup audio then. And you can use the scheduler to determine whether or not it can or can't be used at any particular point.
Good point. Okay.
Yeah. Jeff, and one other thing this USB stick can do, and it's one of the parts of the rules that not too many folks are aware of, at least in the commercial realm of FM translators, but the FCC does allow every translator to run an originated 30-second announcement. The way the FCC's rules speak of it, it's an acknowledgement of contributions or acknowledgement of financial support. But I mean, really, what you're talking about is a commercial. And so if for whatever reason a translator wanted to run something that wasn't run on the primary station, whatever that might be, for 30 seconds each hour, it could do that, and it could use this internal USB player. The other aspect of this is translator transmitters can broadcast emergency announcements without them going over the main station, so the primary station. So in a time when the primary station went down, it might be that this whole USB streaming aspect of the transmitter could be used for emergency transmissions in that time of emergency.
That's a very good point, John. And one of the cool things about that internal playout system in the VS series is that you can not only modify the playlist, but you can upload new content in either WAV format or MP3 format to the transmitter via IP from anywhere. So very powerful. Let's talk about the Orban inside.
Okay, on the VS, we're transmitter people, first and foremost, always have been, probably always will be. I mean, I don't look into the future very well, so I'm not going to say for sure, but the odds are good. So it made sense when we wanted to add processing to go with somebody that knew how to do processing. And what we've got is an Orban 5500 on a single card. So you got a 5-band, 2-band processor that you've got full access and control to via the user interface on the front of the transmitter. It'll work with any of the audio inputs on the transmitter except the composite, and it will handle anything else, whether it's the streaming, shoutcast, icecast, live wire, left and right, whatever. The price point on it, I mean, it works out to typically around about $1,100. So relative to a standalone processor, it's pretty price competitive for something equivalent. It's a couple $1,000s less.
The real benefit to having it is because it operates after the switching from all of those different audio inputs. So it continues to process the transmitted audio, regardless of how that input switch works. If you've switched from USB to left and right, or from a whatever input, it processes them all.
Well, exactly. I mean, if you're running USB audio, whether it's the 30-second underwriting spot like John had mentioned, or a station ID, or overnight programming on a Class D AM, that USB stick's plugged directly into the transmitter, so you've got no way to process it outside of this. And it just gives you a really convenient way to do that. There's a good picture of one of the setup screens. You're looking at the AGC tab. As you can see at the top of it, there's 8 or 9 different tabs for various functions. You can load default presets, tweak them, customize them, save them. You've got the ability to look at an audio and input level and gain reduction meter. So it's a pretty powerful processor, and it's built right in as an option.
And you can do this. You can do this and see all this from some distance, actually.
One of the coolest things about it is that if you've got, for example, I mean, I've sat with customers in McDonald's parking lots hacking into their Wi-Fi, tweaking the sound over their car stereo.
Yep.
You know, would I do it that way? Well, I think audio processing is a very slow and precise process over several weeks, as I hear it in different places on different receivers, but it gives you the ability to do that if you so desire.
Absolutely. Let's talk about the other legalities of this whole process, John.
Sure. I love that screen on the Nautel Orban inside. It's just something to keep your program director and operations manager occupied, isn't it? I guess they could drive themselves crazy over several weeks trying to make the sound perfect. So that's good. We've mentioned some of these things before, but let's go over them rather quickly, and then we'll see if we get any questions on these at the end. Station ID announcements, different for FM translators. It's either over the air between 7 and 9 a.m., 12:55 and 1:05 p.m., and 4 to 6 p.m., or you don't have to worry about it at all if you've got the Morse code FSK ID enabled in the transmitter. The FCC requires when you build this thing that you got to have a sign at the transmitter site in a visible location with the name, address, telephone number of the licensee or local representative, and a name and address where the station's records are maintained. In most cases, if you're rebroadcasting an AM station, that address and name and all will be the name of the licensee of the AM station, probably the chief engineer, and a telephone number there. But it's different from AM and FM operations where you don't need a sign at transmitter site for that, but for an FM translator, you do need that sign at the transmitter site, even if it's the AM site and it's otherwise painfully apparent. I would assume that it's the AM station's translator. The FCC doesn't require any local public file for the FM translator, but it does require that the station licensee of the translator be maintaining in its business files at a place either where the primary station is or in the community of license to which the translator is licensed. The FCC licenses, any official correspondence from the FCC, any consent for rebroadcast if the primary station is not also the licensee of the translator, and in a rule that's about to be eliminated under Chairman Pai's most recent initiative to try to get rid of unneeded FCC rules, the rules still require that FM translator licensees, unlike full service stations, have a copy of the FCC rules there at the business location. So something to mention here is that well, and I just lost my train of thought on that score. I guess the other subjects you have on your legal notes here is can you move it? Well, yeah, it's the same thing as filing for the original construction permit. If the frequency and the other technical specifications allow it, you can change height. You can change to a different channel if it's allowed under the Commission's minor change rules. A note on translators, which we haven't touched on yet, is height. Usually height trumps all. And if you're on your AM tower, simply moving to a taller tower in the vicinity may give your translator a lot better coverage. So that's something to consider, even if you initially get it on the air at the AM tower. The other thing is the channel that you're on. There are some horribly congested channels out there, and there are some cleaner channels. And you may find that the channel you're on isn't the optimum channel, and there may be changes that take place to the FM band as time goes on. So it's worthwhile for translators.
Jeff, are you still there? Can you hear me?
Yep, I'm still here.
I think we've lost John. So let's move on for a second. John, are you back? Afraid not. Okay, well, that was unfortunate. So let's talk, Jeff, about this next slide. EAS is not required under Part 74. So basically, there are no requirements for EAS under Part 74 for what we're talking about here.
No, typically, I mean, a lot of translators being co-located with their AM or as an in-contour and repeating the same audio will be repeating any ES messages that the primary station repeats, and that's fine. But there is no requirement, for example, for the AM Class D daytimer to be originating EAS alerts after hours.
What about the effect of RBDS, John, or Jeff? How can it be used?
Well, the big thing to remember is that you can't put the translator call sign on it because RBDS only lends itself to a 4-digit call sign and in the PI code. You could put that in the PS code if you wished. You absolutely can do the scrolling PS if you've got the ability to get artist and song title from your studio to your transmitter, then you can absolutely use that if you wish to. It's going to be a little different from station to station and how folks want to use it and what they can do with it depending on their configuration. So it's definitely something to talk to your manufacturer about, whether it's the support guys after the fact or the sales guys prior to.
Sure. So what about the impact of HD radio technology on on AM translators?
I'm going to let John address that a little. I think he's back. John, can we hear you now?
I am back. Can you hear me?
Great, we hear you.
Oh, good. All right.
Okay.
Well, so much for the internet, I guess.
I guess.
I've been asked a number of times, gee, can I originate programming if I run an HD2 or HD3 on my translator transmitter? And the answer is pretty much no. I've checked with the FCC staff on that. A translator has to rebroadcast a primary station. So theoretically, you could rebroadcast another AM on your HD2 or HD3 or another HD2 on your HD3, but I don't see the point in that, but somebody may come up with a point for that. The advantage I would see in running HD would be radio with pictures. You'd be able to run the logos and be able to run the HD information that now typically displays in many modern automobile radios, and that would be a great advantage for a translator to be running both the logos and the song information that's going over the air.
Well, for no other reason than to differentiate oneself from the other AM stations.
Right.
Well, that's right.
You've also got data services, Next Radio, BTC, Traffic Consortium, various things like that. So potentially you could be running data services as well.
Well, another important thing is, and we haven't said it, but one of the things that I always find is that people are always surprised by how far 250 watts ERP will go. You can cover a lot of territory with this, particularly if your transmitter site is near the center of the city of license.
I've got a customer in one of the top, I'm looking up my Arbitron map now, it's definitely a top 100 market. I think it's a top 50 market. And they've got a translator running 100 watts at 900 feet, smack dab in the middle of a city of a couple of million people. And he said, if I had known how far these went from the get-go, we'd never have built a Class C.
Okay. So
Chuck,
this is, yeah, go ahead.
Before we end up here, let me just mention, I think you raised a little bit of the interference issue before, and I think it's worth saying that every translator is precarious under the current FCC rules. And just to mention, there's been 2 petitions for rulemaking filed that I really do suggest to everyone that it's worth reading and seeing what the FCC has before it. One is a petition for rulemaking filed by Aztec Capital Partners, Inc., and the RM number is 11786. They advocate a balancing of the equities between local listeners listening to FM stations and local listeners listening to FM translator stations, instead of the procedure by which now one interference complaint or less than a handful of interference complaints at a distant location can take an FM translator off the air based on interference. The other is a petition for rulemaking filed by the National Association of Broadcasters. That's RM 11787. And if you want to take a look at either of those, just putting in FCC and then ECFS into Google will come up with the search screen to put either of those rulemaking numbers in, and you'll be able to take a look at those petitions for rulemaking, which propose changes to the FCC's translator interference rules, which at this point do put translators in a precarious position.
Good information. Thank you, John. I do want to try to get at some of these questions. We've got a boatload of questions here, and a lot of them are very well considered. So I want to try to run some of these past you, and the rest of them we'll have to answer offline. Any FM translator acquired as part of the most recent window and the upcoming window is permanently linked to its parent AM station, correct? It can't ever be sold separately?
Easy answer. That is correct.
Okay, good one. Thanks. So the mutually exclusive will be handled before the CPs are issued for all others in this last filing window?
The way the FCC is now handling it, the audio division, is they have put out a list of the mutually exclusive applications and given a 60-day time period for these applicants to try to settle the mutual exclusivity. That settlement period ends November 29th. And then once that settlement period is done, and there's going to be some technical shifting around in that settlement period. A translator on one channel might move itself to another channel. So once all that is solidified, then what we expect next is the FCC is going to put out a public notice that says to every singleton application, then that would be the mutually exclusive ones who also were able to settle and get out of the conflict. They're going to say to every application that now is not conflicting, you now have an opportunity to file a long form application for your FM translator, and that would be the application in which the actual antenna would be specified along with all other technical information.
Okay. What is the timing requirement for turning off a translator if the main transmitter goes off?
It's not specified in the FCC rules. I believe the word immediate might be used, but I'm not sure about that.
Okay. This is a comment about the method of moments discussion we were having. Mounting of a translator antenna on an AM tower that is part of an MOM-proof directional AM array, the FCC would want a tower-based open circuit self or short circuit self, whichever was used in the original AM method of moments proof. Measurement made. This would be on the involved tower and quite often on all array towers to demonstrate no impact. If any impedance changes within the allowable tolerance, you just report it and no further action is needed. However, if the impedance changes beyond the tolerance, the AM station will have to conduct a new method of moments proof. So that's good information, and thank you for that. If a translator is located at the studio, can the AM transmitter use the translator's FM signal for audio input?
Sure. There's no restriction on that.
Okay. Talking about in-contour feeds, can you briefly walk through what are the specifics for an in-contour feed?
Anything terrestrial, just anything other than a satellite can feed the transmitter. An STL, over the air, internet, copper wire, whatever you want to use.
Okay, and what happens if the AM transmitter fails but the translator is directly fed?
It must go off the air.
Right.
And that's where it's section 74-1234A2 of the Commission's rules. 74-1234A2 is the non-radiating mode portion of the FCC's rules that speak to this. The word, I just looked at it, I don't think the word immediate is not in there, but it just says requires an automatic circuit on the FM translator to place it in a non-radiating mode. And to me, if it's an automatic circuit, that sort of implies immediacy.
Yep. Okay, how does PPM play with all this?
Whatever PPM encoder is put on the AM also goes over the FM translator.
Automatically.
I had years ago, this goes back several years, but I had discussions with the audio division staff as to whether a separate PPM encoder could be placed on an FM translator. And this was in the context of running an HD2 signal where a station was desirous of knowing whether they had, where the listeners were. Was it to the HD2 or was it to the translator? And I was just emphatically told that no, you can't put different stuff on the translator than you're putting over the air on the primary station. That was the way they put it to me in non-technical terms.
Great information. So that's all the questions we've got time for today. I want to thank everybody for being a part of this. I want to tell you that there's some places that you can go to get more information. The Nautel Waves newsletter is always informative. There's a whole library of probably nearly 100 webinars on our website. And then we have all that stuff up on our YouTube channel as well. Thank you for being a part of this. For more information from Nautel, info@nautel.com will always get answered. And for John Garziglia, you can reach him with the email address jgarziglia@wcsr.com. Sounds like a call sign, John.
It's changing. We're getting rid of it amazingly because my law firm's merging with a British firm in actually about half a month. So that's going to change. It's going away. But yeah, I loved it because it did sound like a radio station.
Absolutely. Don't forget to register for our November 1st webinar, just a couple of weeks away, on getting content to and from the transmitter site. You can sign up at our webinars website. We've gone a little bit long, but there was so much good information. John Garziglia, thank you for being a part of this and adding so much.
Loved it. Thank you very much.
And Mr. Welton, always a pleasure.
As always, it certainly was, Chuck. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. For Nautel, for John Garziglia, for Jeff Welton, I'm Chuck Kelly, thanking you for being a part of our webinar today.